Thank you, Janice, and I hope everybody can hear me. As Janice said, welcome to the Manitoba School Boards Association webinar on balancing education and fiscal responsibilities. My name is Paul Cuthbert. I'm a recently retired superintendent for the Evergreen School Division, where I served for 12 years. I'm now working as an education leadership consultant to school divisions and other education organizations such as MSBA and MASS, and continue to serve in an advisory and governance capacity with provincial, national, and international organizations. If you are listening to this as a recording, the original air date was February 3rd, 2016. I understand we have representatives from 12 school divisions registered for today's session, so welcome to you all. This webinar is part of the E2G series on effective and efficient governance. E2G is part of the standards framework developed by MSBA for effective and efficient governance. The framework is common to many school board associations and considers how optimally functioning school boards strike a balance between efficiency and effectiveness. It also addresses how boards may meet their responsibilities to students and communities to the highest standard. If you look at the slide on your screen, you'll see the outcomes for today's workshop. As the outcomes suggest, this webinar is intended to provide a broad overview of how boards may consider their governance responsibilities and how administration may support their boards in approaching their budget process in order to best meet the needs of their students and communities. This webinar is not intended to be a how-to workshop on education finance or frame accounting. Your superintendent and secretary-treasurer should be a great resource to you if you're looking for specific information on your division's funding, budget, and expenditures. I've also designed the session with the assumption that participants have been through at least one budget planning process with their school division, although I do understand that some of you may have extensive experience. I will attempt to answer any questions as they're posted to the screen input window, as I mentioned earlier. But please be aware that I will stay on the line if your questions don't get attended to. We have the slide on the screen now that says who's responsible. As we know, school boards constitute one of the oldest and most enduring forms of elected representation in Canada. For most of the 20th century and now into the 21st century, school boards have remained strong and effective institutions of community voice and represent an exemplar of local democratic process. Over time, public education in Canada and Manitoba have seen many shifts in terms of the size, structure, and functions of school boards in response to changing economic, social, and political developments. In Manitoba, the provincial government has delegated much of its constitutional responsibility for education to school boards through legislation in the Public Schools Act and Education Administration Act, which are binding upon all public school boards. Manitoba today remains as the only province in Canada that provides local boards the unlimited ability to tax. As you know, there are benefits to funding education locally. It respects a community's ability to determine the level and type of education programs delivered locally. Local governance also provides an opportunity for solutions to mirror the needs and interests of the local community, something that's hard to achieve with a centralized governance model. The community and the ratepayers then hold the school division accountable for decisions it makes regarding the education access and programming made available to the youth that they serve. The discourse of public education in Canada has come to highlight three primary characteristics that serve to define what is public about its delivery, in addition to the discussion of the public purposes of education. In John Young's paper included in your resources, he refers to these three characteristics as touchstones of public education. They are, number one, public access and equality, that all children should have access to and the opportunity to benefit equally from schooling regardless of such factors as race, class or gender, sexual orientation, or where they live. Number 2, public funding, that the costs of schooling should be shared fairly across all segments of the public, and that the quality of education received by any child is not related to the ability of the child or their parents to pay for that schooling. And number 3, public control, that decisions about the nature of public schooling are made through public political processes and by persons elected to carry out this responsibility. These touchstones will provide a foundation for the rest of my presentation today. The significance of the 3 touchstones of public accessibility, control, and funding in framing the educational finance debate in Manitoba is well illustrated by the guiding principles adopted by a broadly based ministers' working group on education finance, which, when reporting in July 2004, articulated the following 5 key principles that had guided its deliberations and its analysis of alternative funding arrangements. These principles largely remain in effect today. Underpinning each of these principles is the importance of public support for and confidence in public education, particularly in the current context of increasing demands on other government services and continued government interest in reducing levels of taxation. Adequate levels of public funding require the construction and nurturing of this support within the public consciousness. In this regard, it is the public perception of value and the public perception of fairness that is crucial in terms of the debates regarding education funding. In Manitoba, the leadership of school boards and their senior administration occupy a central position in the education finance debates. The ability of school boards to set a local mill rate in support of their education and their role in continually advocating for and building local support for increased levels of provincial funding are critical to ensuring adequate funding. The ability to tax also brings public scrutiny regarding whether school boards are spending their money wisely. We hope that the cartoon on the screen does not represent the public or media views of your school division. As such, it is incumbent upon school divisions to continue to inform the public trust. In Manitoba, the financing of public schools is a joint responsibility of the provincial government and school boards. Annually, the provincial government assesses its resources and priorities in areas of responsibility such as health, child and family services, and education, and determines how much money it will provide for public schools. The Provincial Department of Education then allocates a share of those dollars to each school division in accordance with a very complex formula. The exact amount varies from division to division. The province may also issue budget instructions and requirements and establishes a framework for school divisions to use when reporting expenditures. I have included a copy of this year's funding announcement in the resources section of the website. The Funding of Schools program is established by the provincial government within the Public Schools Act and associated regulations and comprises operating and capital support for public school divisions in Manitoba. It is administered by the Schools Finance Branch and the Public Schools Finance Board. The current provincial funding formula has different categories of funding that provide support for school divisions based on their demographics, tax base, and programming needs. Base support is provided on a per-student basis. Categorical funding is provided for transportation, special needs, and programming costs. Equalization support is provided to recognize the varying ability of school divisions to meet the cost of unsupportable program requirements through the property tax base. The equalization support formula is based on an equalization factor determined from property assessment divided by enrollment applied to unsupportable expenditures. Additional equalization is provided for those school divisions with higher mill rates. Other guarantees and grants are provided by government based on current provincial initiatives and tax credit programs. And a few of these are highlighted on your screen, such as the General Support Grant, Property Tax Credit, Tax Incentive Grant, which was put in place a few years ago, and the recent 20K3 grants. Once a school division determines that its projected expenditures, what its projected expenditures are, and the amount of provincial support it will receive, any shortfall can be raised through special levy. Other factors may also limit or determine how a school division will allocate funds. Most school divisions carry an operating surplus, a prudent financial practice that can provide the division with emergency funding that may be unforeseen. Divisions may choose to use some of their operating surplus to fund one-time expenditures. In addition, the Minister of Education may place a restriction on surplus funds. The current guideline is set at 4% of overall budget. Any funds in surplus over the 4% threshold must be applied to special levy. In addition to surplus decisions, school divisions may also be faced with decisions regarding division administrative expenditures. The Minister of Education may also set restrictions on expenditures in these areas. The current guidelines vary between 3.5% and 5%, with northern and rural being allowed slightly higher percentages than the urban. Reserves are an excellent source of revenue for school divisions who engage in 3 to 5 year cycles of financial planning. Anticipated large capital expenditures can be funded by saving a percentage of funding on an annual basis and placing these funds in a reserve. Good examples of this would be expenditures such as unsupported building projects or technology hardware expenditures. Financial stewardship is a major responsibility of all school boards, and some would argue that it is the most important responsibility. 3 basic stewardship imperatives that school boards should consider are duty of care, duty of due diligence, and accountability to the public. In order to fulfill your fiduciary responsibility to communities and your educational responsibility to students, school trustees require a good understanding of both the funding or revenue side and the budgeting expenditure side of public schools finance. In consultation with your community, the school board establishes divisional priorities and goals which are reflected in the annual budget. The school board develops and ultimately approves this budget, which is reported to both government and community. If education finance is ultimately about the provision and utilization of resources, mainly human resources, in pursuit of your mission, vision, and goals, then it clearly concerns more than the political decisions made annually by the budgetary allocations made by individual school boards, important as those decisions are. It is the responsibility of the board and administration to allocate appropriate resources to the operations and programming of the division to serve the academic interests and well-being of all students and staff across your division. In his book, The Money Myth, School Resources, Outcomes, and Equity, Grubb in 2009 reminds us that adequate funding is necessary but not a sufficient variable in the provision of quality and equitable schooling. Many of the most powerful determinants of school success, such as quality teaching, school climate, or parental orientation towards academic success and career aspirations, cannot simply be purchased. We also know that any discussion of education funding is not primarily about money, but rather about resources. Centrally, it is about what that money can provide by way of educational resources and how those resources are used in support of high quality and equitable experiences for all students. In 2014, The Manitoba Association of School Superintendents commissioned a discussion paper entitled Education Finance and the Pursuit of the Goal of a High-Quality, Universally Accessible Public School System in Manitoba. Where are we, what challenges remain, and how can we meet them? This paper is grounded in the concept of equity and highlights current funding practices and their relationship to school outcomes in Manitoba public schools. It is certainly worth a read and raises many issues for boards to consider in education funding, such as the relationship between expenditures and outcomes for students. I have posted this paper in our resources section of the webinar, and it may also be found at MASS's website and the address that's shown on your screen right now. Framed by the guiding question, how can decisions about education funding bring us closer to the vision of a universally quality public education as articulated in the provincial mission statement? The current MASS discussion paper focuses its attention on 5 aspects of current funding practices and school outcomes in Manitoba provincial public schools. These aspects are shown on your screen. Underpinning the discussion of the 5 issues identified above are the touchstones that were raised earlier in my presentation. That is, public accessibility and equality, public funding, and public control. In addition, it is assumed that quality and equity in public schooling are complementary and not competing objectives. Developing a budget that optimally aligns resources with student outcomes will, for many school divisions, entail making significant changes in how resources are allocated. Therefore, many long-standing assumptions about how to best develop a budget may need to be changed. A set of principles and policies and administrative procedures agreed to by the school board and the administration can provide a foundation for what matters most in the budgeting process, creating optimal student learning and well-being with the money that's available. The Government Finance Officers Association, or GFOA, has developed a series of documents entitled Best Practices in School District Budgeting, which clearly outlines steps to developing a budget that best aligns resources with student outcomes. These documents have been provided in the resource section of the webinar and at the website referenced on your screen. Number 1, the planning and budgeting process begins with mobilizing key stakeholders, gathering information on student outcome indicators, cost structure, and establishing principles and policies to guide the budget process. Number 2, the budget needs to be rooted in priorities of the division. Intentionally created instructional priorities provide a strong basis for developing a division's budget and strategic plan. Number 3, current resources and expenditures must be thoroughly analyzed in order to find capacity to pay for top priorities. Number 4, the strategic plan is a long-term roadmap for implementing the division's instructional priorities. A plan of action describes how the strategic plan will be translated into coherent, actionable steps. And number 5, the planning and budgeting process should be one that can be replicated in the future or be sustainable in order to ensure the division remains focused and plans accordingly for reaching its student outcomes. A set of principles and policies agreed to by the school board and the staff before the budgeting process begins can provide a touchstone for what matters most in the budgeting process, creating the greatest student outcomes with the money available. Budgeting principles and policies should be developed collaboratively by the division's school board and the administration who develop and recommend the budget. Clear goals for students should guide how resources are allocated. Tracking progress or making tough budget decisions to prioritize programs and strategies is impossible without specific goals. Making decisions that will impact the future of children can raise emotions, leading to gut decisions, decisions that don't optimize student outcomes for the available money. The budget process should seek to allocate available dollars optimally in a way that will create the most benefit for the children given the costs. In other words, the best value. Budget processes are typically incremental, where last year's spending becomes the basis for next year's budget, with incremental changes made around the margin. However, past patterns of spending may no longer be affordable or even relevant given the changing needs of the community and student body. School divisions must make sure every student is given an equal chance to succeed. As it relates to the budget process, this means promoting equality in funding among the general student population while providing extra support for struggling students to also provide them with the opportunities to succeed, a concept known as equity. Many school divisions will not be able to make large changes to their educational strategies and resource allocation patterns within a single year. Further, a consistent application of proven strategies over a multi-year period will produce better results. Therefore, to the degree possible, divisions should develop and adhere to a multi-year funding plan to their strategies, with the goal of fully funding and realigning resources where necessary to fund high-priority elements of the strategies. Effective budgeting requires valid information about the true costs of servicing students and the outcomes produced for students. This information should be made available to all key stakeholders. Budget policies clarify a division's intention excuse me, on how it will manage its resources by identifying acceptable and unacceptable courses of financial action, establishing parameters in which the division can operate, and providing a standard against which the division's fiscal performance can be judged. Budget policies or associated administrative procedures are often technical in nature and thus require some budgeting acumen to develop and implement. A division is recommended to have policies or administrative procedures related to its general fund reserve, response to financial emergency, long-term forecasting, asset management and replacement, budgeting for staff compensation, review and sunsetting of programs, the definition of a balanced budget, year-end savings, and reserve allocations, and also funding for new programs. It is incumbent for boards to use multiple sources of information and evidence to support their budget process. The list on your screen shows some common sources, such as your division foundations or mission, vision, values, and beliefs, your strategic or education plan, public input, division indicators or data sets, and frame or data comparisons. The provincial frame document available on the Manitoba Education and Advanced Learning website provides some excellent comparative data. Different divisions use different strategies to engage the public in their planning and decision-making process. The graphic on your screen illustrates a sample planning cycle which allows for community input at 3 different times annually, and that's shown with the green boxes on the diagram. 2 times at the division level and 1 time at the school level. It also demonstrates how the public input precedes the planning, which then informs the budget process. Janice is just informing me that we're losing my signal here. Hopefully you can still see me. Hopefully we're still here. Janice, are we okay? I'll move to the next slide then. Okay, she's telling me we're back here. Sorry about that. Being from rural Manitoba, you know the challenges of broadband internet connections. So if you look at the cartoon on the screen, you can see that some school divisions have resorted to becoming very creative in terms of attracting people to their budget consultation meetings. The school divisions have traditionally had low taxpayer turnout, unless there's some kind of a... Okay. So we're back here on the screen, and as I said, school divisions should consider some alternative forms of engagement strategies. And if you look on the screen, some of the more traditional ones are public. Wish you all the best in your efforts. And so that basically concludes my presentation for today. I'm hoping that you found some of the information to be useful to you, and I'm hoping that the resources that are posted on the MSBA website will also be of use to you as you engage in further budget deliberations. And I want to wish you all the best in terms of making those difficult budget decisions this year, because I know it's a very difficult decision to make every year.